This is Ryan Cook from Moody Theological Seminary, and in this video, I want to talk a little bit about how to interpret Old Testament narrative. Now, I have three children, and when my children were young and I would put them to bed at night, very regularly, they would ask me, "Dad, can you tell me a story?" It's interesting, I never once, in all the years of putting children to bed at night, I never once had them ask me, "Can you tell me some facts, Dad? I just want some more information." There's something about stories that resonate with us as human beings. They're one of the primary ways that we communicate to each other, and even in understanding our own lives, we think about it in a story form. It's not surprising then that the Old Testament is comprised primarily of narrative or stories. It's the most predominant genre in the Old Testament. So how should we approach these narratives? In this video, I want to show some techniques that are helpful in learning to read Old Testament narratives well. These aren't the only techniques that you need. Your textbook has a number of other really important tools for you, but these are some additional tools to help supplement that. Old Testament narratives are carefully crafted, and we need to be able to slow down and notice the details. Now, how to construct and interpret narratives has been a topic of conversation for millennia. Aristotle famously described how every story has three parts: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, that may seem obvious enough, but the point he was making is that narratives are intentionally shaped and crafted works. They're not just describing what happened, but they're telling it in a particular way. And it's through the way in which narrative is told that we're able to discover the theology and meaning the author intended. Now, I want to describe some of the elements of interpreting narrative and use as an example passage the short episode in which Esau sold his birthright to Jacob in Genesis 25, verses 27 to 34. Now, the beginning of a narrative includes the setting, that is, the context in which the story takes place. Sometimes the setting described is geographical. For example, in Exodus 3, just before the burning bush episode, Moses is placed geographically, very carefully in the story. The narrator tells us that Moses was pasturing the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The fact that this encounter at the burning bush happened at Horeb is really important for understanding that narrative well. In our passage, the setting is described in verse 27, and it begins with this phrase, "when the boys grew up." The opening phrase gives us a setting not in geography. We actually never find out exactly where this story takes place in terms of the geography of ancient Israel. Instead, we're given a setting in time, when the boys grew up. In the previous story, we read about how Rebecca felt a struggle in her womb when she was pregnant with the twins. Because of this, she sought a prophetic word from the Lord, and the Lord gave her an oracle, a prophecy about these two boys that were about to be born. Then we get the birth scene where Jacob and Esau are born. Esau comes out first with his brother Jacob grabbing at the heel. And now, in one word in Hebrew, a lot of time has passed when the boys grew up. And the reference to the Jacob and Esau here as boys indicates that they're not children anymore. The word here is na'arim. It's a young men would be a good way to translate that. So quite a few years have passed. They're now grown young men still living at home. And that's our new temporal scene for this particular story. As a part of the setting, we also get an initial characterization of Jacob and Esau. It says, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a civilized man living in tents. So these boys are described based on what their interests are, what their loves are, and where they spend their time. Esau loves being outside. He's a hunter, a man of the field. Jacob, kind of the opposite, more of a homebody, living in tents, staying close to the camp. Then we're given one more piece of information for the setting, and the author gives us a relational setting. Verse 28 says, "Now Isaac loved Esau." And not only does the text tell us that Isaac loved Esau, but it actually gives the reason why. Because he had a taste for game. In fact, the Hebrew there reads very literally, because of the game in his mouth. There's a very kind of sensual aspect to Isaac's love for Esau because he likes his food. Esau knew that the best way to his father's heart was through his stomach, right? And that's how Esau is characterized, by the love of his father. the text then says, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And there's no reason given. It just says that she loved him. Now, as a reader, we might wonder, is that because in the previous story, she had received an oracle from the Lord declaring that the older would serve the younger? Maybe it's more a statement of faith in that element, or maybe it's because Jacob likes to be more of a homebody and maybe is around more often. But either way, the setting is these boys are grown, they're very different, and they're defined by their parents' love. Is going to have a huge impact in their lives. Now, in order for a narrative to be a narrative, you have to have conflict. There's no such thing as a story without conflict. Imagine I came to you and said, let me tell you a story. Yesterday, I went to the store, bought some bananas, and came home. I think you'd be a little disappointed, right? That's not much of a story. That's more of a report. A story needs some tension, and that's part of the narrative arc. Will David be able to stand up to Goliath? Will Abraham sacrifice his son? The tension drives the story forward. So there's that initial setting given. You want to look at that. How is the author describing the setting? And then where is the conflict? Where is the conflict in the story? Verses 29 to 32 in this passage describe the tension. Let's go ahead and read it and walk through it. It says, when Jacob had cooked stew one day, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a mouthful of that red stuff there, for I am exhausted. Therefore he was called Edom by name. But Jacob said, first sell me your birthright. Esau said, look, I am about to die, so what use is the birthright to me? And Jacob said, first swear to me. So let me just stop there. This is primarily a dialogue between these two brothers. Esau, comes in from the field, and we get this initial encounter between the two of them. It's interesting that when Esau comes in from the field, it says that he's exhausted, and when he approaches Jacob, he doesn't give a greeting, but instead, his first words are shouting out a command. Please give me some of that food. Actually, the way that the Hebrew is written is really interesting here. The first verb here is an unusual one in Hebrew, and linguists best guess at what this particular word means is let me gulp down. Let me gulp down is it's used more of like animal feed than of a person. And then the way Esau describes it, he says, let me gulp down some of that red stuff there, is how the NASB translates it. Very literally, the text reads, let me gulp down that red. It mentions it twice. So that's the whole speech. Literally, the whole speech is, let me gulp down from the red, for I am wiped out. So you have to think of, what can we infer from that speech? How is Esau being characterized? Well, he's being characterized as rather inarticulate. It's an example of what happens regularly in Hebrew narrative of what we call style switching, or adjusting the pattern of speech to make a characterization of one of the people in the narrative. Esau here is someone who is characterized as having strong passions that need to be fulfilled right away. He's being driven by his appetite. The narrator then steps back and lets us know, therefore, he was called Edom by name. Just like Jacob will get another name later on in the narrative because of his actions and requests, he'll be called Israel. Esau is giving another appropriate name based on his actions. The name Edom also demonstrates that the prophecy earlier, if you go back and read it, Rebekah was told that 2 nations were in her womb and 2 peoples from within her would be separated, which this narrative tells us will come true. Esau's descendants will be the forerunners of the people of Edom, the nation of Edom. The 2 nations, Edom and Israel, represented here by Jacob and Esau, will have quite a history of conflict between each other. Edom refused to allow Israel to pass through their territory during the time of the Exodus in Numbers chapter 20. They also sided with the Babylonians against Judah during the exile in Ezekiel 25. So that's Esau's speech. Let's take a look at Jacob's response. Jacob here has a cool reply that is all business. He matches Esau's command with a command of his own. First, sell me your birthright. Now we know from texts in Old Babylonian and from Newsy, ancient texts, that inheritances were bought and sold between brothers. That wasn't that unusual. One text has a brother selling a portion of his inheritance for 3 sheep, which is actually not that different than here. A bowl of soup is a little bit less than 3 sheep. But the reason why this was an issue is the older brother would receive a double inheritance, which may not seem fair to our modern sensibilities, but we have to understand that the older brother was also responsible for caring for aging parents and any other dependent family members. Jacob wanted that position. He wanted that responsibility. He wanted to be considered the firstborn and have the rights and authority that would come with that. And so he saw an opportunity and he jumped at it. So what does that tell us about Jacob? He's kind of a manipulator, right? He's tries to turn things to his advantage. So now that's the tension in the story. What is Esau going to do here? What's going to happen? How will things turn out? And that leads us to our resolution. The end of verse 32 and into verse 33. Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die, so of what use then is a birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore an oath to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and got up and went on his way. So Esau despised his birthright. Esau's response matches what we would expect. He says, "Look, I'm about to die," which is surely an exaggeration in this context. And then he says, "What good is the birthright to me?" The position of firstborn did not mean that much to Esau. But Jacob presses the advantage. He wants to get an official agreement from Esau, and he says, "Swear to me right now, swear to me today." So Esau goes along with it and sells his birthright. Now, after giving him the lentil stew, the narrator uses a succession of 4 very quick verbs that further characterize Esau. He ate and drank and got up and went on his way. It's like he didn't even give it a second thought. There's no regret. And then the final comment, I think, is really important in the narrative. In Genesis, the author rarely makes value judgments on the actions of characters. Normally, we have to kind of infer those judgments based on the way something's written. But here, the narrator clearly states Esau despised his birthright. What this story tells us is that Esau didn't care much for the position of firstborn. At this point, it's appropriate to reflect on the significance of this episode within the larger narrative. Why were we told this story? In terms of narrative time, the author jumped from the birth of twins until they were young men in one verse. Here, the author slowed down to provide us with a detailed account of this one encounter between Jacob and Esau as young men. Why do we need to know this? Let me suggest a couple of reasons. First, it lets us know that Esau was not deserving of the birthright. It's not just that Jacob tricked him out of it. Rather, Esau did not want the responsibility of the firstborn. Secondly, it characterizes Jacob as a trickster and a master manipulator. We'll see this aspect continually at work in his deceiving of his father to steal the blessing, but he'll also be the victim of deceptive actions by his uncle Laban. Third, this passage also clarifies the relationship between Israel and Edom. Fourth, the passage shows how God's word shapes history. Rebekah was told before the twins were born that 2 peoples would come from these twins. Jacob is the head of Israel, and Esau is the head or father of the Edomites. She was also told that the older would serve the younger, and we see the beginning of that happening here. So in reading a narrative, you want to notice the story arc, the setting, conflict, and resolution. You also want to ask, why is the story included here? What's the significance of it? Also notice the details of characterization. All these things work together to articulate and communicate the theology of the passage.